October 26, 1961, Berlin. The Earth is on the verge of a global nuclear catastrophe. The world's attention is focused on the checkpoint at Friedrichstrasse. It is here that the tanks of the Cold War resolutely faced each other, ready to rush into attack at any moment.
Работали двигатели, они газовали. И, собственно говоря, в любой момент, если бы поступила команда, то огонь был бы открыт.
The wall was built because the US, Britain and Germany refused to transfer the western part of Berlin to the East Germans. In response, the authorities in the DDR began to build a dividing wall through the center of the city.
Этот кризис вообще мог перерасти в Третью мировую войну. И, в общем-то, стоял вопрос о применении ядерного оружия даже.
At this time, the United States had the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. The USSR had a few atomic bombs, but their power terrified the enemy. Just 3 days after the tank confrontation at Checkpoint Charlie, the Soviet Union would test the Tsar bomb.
Взрыв сопровождался световой вспышкой необычной силы. Вспышка и последующие свечения были видны в радиусе до 1000 километров.
A giant thermonuclear weapon with a capacity of 58.5 million tons of TNT. The shockwave from the explosion circled the globe 3 times. The mushroom cloud reached a height of 67 kilometers. Such a powerful weapon had never been seen before. I'm Marina Kostrova, and today I'm going to take a look at the evolution of Cold War-era tanks, as well as some unique equipment and machines that were produced by the tens of thousands. At the end of World War II, American aircraft destroyed the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 4 years later, the Soviet Union set off its first nuclear explosion. In the 50s, nuclear tests were performed regularly, and the effects of the blasts were carefully studied. Turns out that the consequences of an atomic strike wouldn't be so terrible for tanks. However, in order to maintain combat effectiveness, a significant revision was required. Armor is good at keeping crews safe from deadly heat radiation. It can also save a tank's electronics from electromagnetic waves caused by nuclear explosions. But no armor can withstand a neutron flux. To completely protect tanks from its overpowering effects, the engineers began to line the inside with a layer of polyethylene. And in order to protect crews from nuclear fallout, the vehicles needed to be completely sealed. And all these goals were achieved in the 1950s. We're in the town of Kubinka, in one of the best tank museums in the world. This is where some unique exhibits are kept. The rare diamonds of Soviet technology, often preserved in just a single copy. Many of the ingenious design ideas implemented in these machines are classified to this day. With a diameter of 11 meters, one of these machines looks more like a flying saucer. This is Exhibit 279, a real-life Judgment Day weapon. Now, in the early days of the Cold War, Soviet and American military strategists assumed that the next war would be nuclear, since both superpowers had nukes, so why not use them? And this piece of machinery here is a perfect example of the armament race. Can you smell that Cold War air inside? I certainly can. Let's head inside and see what it looks like. This 60-ton heavyweight could reach speeds of up to 55 kilometers per hour. With its flattened tower, it left competitors in the dust in terms of protection, but at the expense of comfort. It's so difficult to get inside. I mean, obviously, I guess I would feel very safe in here, but it's so tight. This curved shell protected the tank from all projectiles in existence at the time. Now, what is truly unique about Exhibit 279 is the armor, because it has to pull double duty. It had to resist anti-tank rounds and nuclear blasts. Now, if I step away, you can see here that it had a downward sloping disc-shaped armored hull. Now, the armor was of variable sizes. At its maximum, the thickness reached over 260 millimeters. That's over 10.5 inches thick. Soviet engineers boosted Exhibit 279's armor to the max, making it almost 5 times tougher than the classic T-34s. Even though it was designed in the 1950s, the main gun would be considered large even by today's standards, of 130 millimeters. If we compare it, for example, to the American M1A1 Abrams tank, that had a smoothbore main gun of 120 millimeters. The main highlight of this foreign tank is its running gear. It has an extra pair of tracks, so it can easily maneuver on sloppy ground during spring. It has 4 tracks for lower ground pressure, and the engine itself is a real beast because it has a 1,000 horsepower, diesel horsepower, I should say, that Americans could only dream of tanks like that. And they did. This is how American engineers envisioned a nuclear-powered tank capable of moving on water and land. In official documents, it was known as the TV-8. The engineers came up with an unusual idea. The engine, crew, and ammunition had to be fit into a huge turret. But the engine could only generate 300 horsepower, which was not very impressive even by the standards of those times. More importantly, the unusual design didn't provide any advantage, and the project was abandoned. All that is left of it are the drawings. Following World War II, the US relied heavily on aviation. American engineers didn't pay as much attention to developing tanks. The mainstay of their armored line was the M4 Sherman and M24 Chaffee tanks. But the Soviet IS-3, which appeared right after World War II, was head and shoulders above them. IS-3, or Joseph Stalin III, nicknamed Pike due to the shape of its front armor, which resembles a pike's nose. Engine 520 horsepower, weight 49 tons. Crew 4 people, front armor 110 millimeters, and cannon 122 millimeters. Even the legendary T-34 with a new 85mm gun was way out of the Shermans and Chaffee's league.
There's a lot of different weapons that can destroy a Sherman. The armor wasn't particularly strong. It does have some slope to it, but not near as much as a T-34 or Panther in terms of the frontal armor protection. They were very vulnerable to enemy tanks, especially Panthers and Tigers, and they're also very vulnerable to man-fired weapons like the Panzer Schreck or the Panzer Faust that at close range could penetrate the hull of a Sherman. Armor doctrine at that time did not really pit a Sherman tank against enemy tanks. That was not our doctrine. The doctrine for armor, for U.S. armor at that time, was support of infantry. This was going with the infantry at infantry speeds, making sure it could protect them.
The war demonstrated how untenable this doctrine was, and in 1945, a new tank, the M26 Pershing, was already introduced in the United States. M26 Pershing. Engine 500 horsepower. Combat weight 43 tons. Crew 5 people. Upper hull armor 102 millimeters. Cannon 90mm gun.
The Pershing was a big departure for U.S. tank doctrine. This was the first heavy tank we really had in the field. And this became a model for tanks going into the Cold War.
Pretty soon, there was a reason to put this machinery to the test. The war between the northern and southern parts of Korea, separated by the 38th parallel, began in 1950. The Soviet Union and China supported the Communist North, while the United States backed the South under the auspices of the UN. The war nearly went nuclear. By order of U.S. President Harry Truman, 9 nuclear bombs were delivered to the base on the island of Okinawa. That would have sufficed to wipe all of North Korea's big cities from the face of the earth. A nuclear attack was to be used as a last resort if the South was ultimately defeated. And while the Americans were preparing another Hiroshima, tanks were bearing the brunt of the fighting. North Korea's main armored force was made up of modernized T-34-85 tanks. The legendary machines that were produced in abundance at the end of World War II were moved to the Korean peninsula. North Korean crews, well trained by Soviet specialists, were waiting for them there.
The 150 or so T-34s that the North Koreans had pummeled through those lines, pushed everyone down literally to the end of the Korean peninsula.
By June of 1950, the North Korean People's Army had 258 T-34-85 tanks at their disposal, a number big enough to hold back the hundreds of American vehicles deployed on the peninsula.
The easiest tanks to move in, the M24 Chaffee because it's light, the M4 Sherman, and then the M26 Pershing. These were vehicles that were in Japan at that time as part of the occupation of Japan.
The first European travelers to set foot in Korea often described it as a frozen sea after a storm. The Korean peninsula is covered with mountain ranges, occupying 2/3 of its territory, so tanks had to move with ease through that uneven surface. How did our T-34s cope? Let's find out. I'm on the T-34 and we are getting ready to take it for a spin and see what it feels like to be inside this tank. We'll also test the uneven surface that we were talking about, and we'll even get to shoot. So, are we ready? It's hard to believe, but this tank, which so easily overcomes obstacles at the Kubinka tank range, is over 77 years old.
I have the driver mechanic on my left. Behind him is the guy who aims, and behind me is the guy who actually shoots.
Механику-водителю приходилось прикладывать немало физических усилий для того, чтобы совершать маневры во время боя. Так как отсутствовала у него автоматика, ему самому приходилось переключать коробку передач. При старте и остановке очень трудно было дергать за рычаги самих.
One of the weak points of the T-34 is that it cannot fire on the move, so it has to come to a complete stop. And then the commander said shorts, which means short stop. 85mm caliber, by the way, and apparently it could easily penetrate the 10-centimeter frontal armor of the German Tiger from a distance of 1 kilometer. So let's check how accurate the T-34 is. Okay, стрелять!
By today's standards, the T-34 is an old-timer, but it's still highly accurate. However, its comfort and ergonomics leave much to be desired.
So every time there are powder gases that are released, and it's very intense, the smell. It's almost like sewage. And that's why back in the day, they used to open the hatch so that the guys, could breathe. And that, of course, added to the T-34's vulnerability. So I saw what it looked like on the inside, but I'm curious what it looks like on the outside and if it's as loud. Wow! I have to say, it's more impressive on the outside. I didn't expect to say that. It's much louder. Maybe it was because I was wearing the helmet, but you can even feel the vibration afterwards. Very, very cool.
У нас за счет худшей оптики второй снаряд всегда бил в цель. Первый мог попасть, мог не попасть. Второй 100%.
The Shermans and Chaffees, which were once the core tanks in America's armored forces, were rendered almost useless against T-34s in Korea.
Для того, чтобы подбить Т-34, им приходилось использовать как минимум 3 маневра. Американский боевой расчет вот на Шермана пишет: мы, говорит, из засады били по гусенице. Он говорит, танк останавливался. После этого второй снаряд бил под башню. Башню заклинило. А потом мы заезжали в бок и расстреливали. Понимаете? То есть это о чем говорит? О полном превосходстве Т-34 над Шерманом.
The 34 finally met a worthy opponent on August 17, 1950. The T-34-85s of the 107th Tank Regiment attacked the positions of the 1st U.S. Marine Brigade at the Busan bridgehead. The North Korean tankers, accustomed to victories, saw the well-known M24 Chappies in front of them and confidently went into battle. But they were wrong. These were M26 Pershings, whose 90mm cannons managed to penetrate 3 T-34-85s.
The Chaffee didn't stand a chance. The M4 was a very difficult battle for Americans to fight against the T-34's firepower and armor. But this was the one tank that could take it out consistently. The one good thing about being in a Pershing was there wasn't much that could destroy you. You were very safe. The frontal of it has extremely thick armor. In areas, it has a mean effectiveness of almost 8 inches of armor with its 4 inches with a slope. The sides were more vulnerable. Tracks are always vulnerable on a tank for almost any weapon. But from what its critical threats were when it went into combat, it really came down to other heavy tanks.
A T-34 cannon could only destroy Pershings with APDS or heat rounds. After the latter of these was invented, the thickness of armor plates ceased to play a decisive role. A shaped charge effect, also known as the Monroe effect, is triggered when all of the explosive's energy is focused in a single direction. This can be achieved by firing a projectile with a cone-shaped cavity whose base faces the target. Rounds utilized in this effect appeared as early as World War II. Famous German Panzerfaust used shaped charged rounds, and one hit was enough to burn through the heavy frontal armor of any tank. If that happened, the entire crew perished.
Кумулятивный заряд, например, на противотанковой управляемой ракете уже достаточно большого калибра мог иметь бронепробиваемость 1000-1200 даже миллиметров.
But by 1948, Moscow Institute of Steel Engineers already knew how to protect tanks from shaped charges. So I assume this is the reactive armor?
Да, это динамическая защита. За рубежом она называется Explosive Reactive Armor.
This is an element in the first generation of an explosive reactive armor complex dubbed Gunduct. On impact, the enemy projectile lost its penetrating power.
Боеприпас этот в состоянии пробить без динамической защиты не менее 300 миллиметров брони средней твердости. Достаточно мощное изделие. Но если на пути будет стоять элемент динамической защиты, он при воздействии взорвется.
Will this unassuming element save a tank? Let's find out. So we're ready to detonate.
Да, сейчас будем производить подрыв. Огонь!
Well, that sounded loud. I wonder what's inside, though. What happened?
Сейчас посмотрим.
And we can go right away. The protective explosive worked very well. The blast deflected the shaped charged jet, which is capable of penetrating solid armor 30 centimeters thick. And absolutely clear here. So great protection.
Да, струя полностью разрушена этой динамической защитой элементов.
But the engineers' main focus during the Cold War was on providing protection against nuclear weapons.
Мир многократно висел на волоске, и развязывание войны именно в Европе, оно было очень и очень реально.
In 1958, the USSR brought the T-55 tank into service, the first in the world to be equipped with a special anti-nuclear protection system. Its brain, if you will, was a sensor that picked up X-ray radiation emitted by nuclear explosions, after which the system stopped the engine and sealed the hull. Everything took place in a split second. T-55, the world's first tank capable of conducting combat operations in a nuclear war. Engine 580 horsepower, combat weight 36 tons, crew 4 people, front armor 100 millimeters, and cannon 100 millimeters. In December 1961, the first regular U.S. troops were deployed in Vietnam. This country, like Korea, was divided into North and South. From the outset, the Americans faced fierce resistance. The partisans were not afraid of America's armored vehicles, in part because the Soviet Union had provided Ho Chi Minh's supporters with a large consignment of anti-tank weapons, including handheld anti-tank grenade launchers, or RPGs. I asked my colleague Alexei Smirnov to test this formidable weapon. With his team, he's tested hundreds of weapon systems, from light rifles to powerful pieces of heavy artillery. Could these weapons have decided the outcome of the Vietnam War? What's the main secret behind rocket-propelled grenades? Alexei, why do you personally like RPGs so much?
РПГ-7 – мое любимое оружие. Почему? Да потому что, когда этот гранатомет в руках, тогда точно что-то бахнет. Да еще как. Ну вот, предохранитель. Взводим. И будем фигарить. Чуть ниже нужно взять. Поехали, господа. У-ху! Выстрел! Вот куда я попал. Отломала, в общем, часть этой штуки. Этот люк был открыт. И теперь он очень сильно закрыт. Да, попадание так себе. Ничего не сделал РПГ этому танку. В общем, чуть не подскользнулся.
Let's see it again. An RPG rocket hits the tank's turret. The shaped charge goes off, but the accuracy isn't great. The rocket ricochets off the modern vehicle's turret and sprays the shaped charge jet out while spinning. But 50 years ago, Vietnamese RPG operators had to deal with simpler tank models. The Vietnamese used RPGs mainly against Patton tanks, the M46, M47, and M48.
The M46 was a follow-on, basically the same tank with a different engine to solve the problems of the mechanical reliability. The M47 and M48 were offshoots of this tank. So this is really the grandfather of most of the vehicles you see throughout the Cold War on the American side.
This tank family was armed with one-piece cast turrets, a powerful 105mm gun, and a laser rangefinder. But none of those bells and whistles were useful in Vietnam.
Я честно скажу, какого-либо существенного влияния на ход боевых действий, даже на тактическом уровне, танки не оказали.
The Vietnamese were able to beat the Pattons at close range by ambushing them in the impenetrable jungle. The United States lost 350 vehicles in the first half of the Vietnam War alone. Most were burnt out with RPG grenade launchers, but it wasn't just that. The North Vietnamese troops also had tanks, Soviet T-54s and T-55s.
Т-54, Т-55 проявили себя исключительно надежными, боеспособными и полностью отвечающими требованиям той войны. Они были простые, вьетнамцами осваивались достаточно быстро, но недаром таким знаменитым на весь мир фото, где уже происходит захват президентского дворца в Сайгоне. Да, это советский танк Т-55, который ломает ворота и врывается на территорию этого дворца. Это, по сути дела, символ победы Северного Вьетнама.
Падение Сайгона, освобождение всего юга страны, сделавшее возможным новое наступление. Мирное наступление за новый социалистический Вьетнам.